War is, among other things, an engineering problem. The specific engineering problem of how to kill human beings more efficiently, more comprehensively, and at greater distances than the previous generation of weapons allowed. Every major war in history has driven weapons technology forward. The pressure of survival and the strategic necessity forcing innovations that peacetime research programs would have taken decades to produce. The Second World War compressed the weapons development timeline more dramatically than any conflict before or since, producing in 6 years a range of new killing technologies whose descendants still shape the battlefield today. The weapons of the Second World War are not all equal in their significance. Some were numerically dominant without being technically revolutionary. Some were technically revolutionary without being numerically decisive. And some combined both qualities in ways that changed not just the specific battles where they were used but the nature of warfare itself, permanently altering what armies could do to each other and to the civilian populations caught between them. This documentary is about 10 of those weapons, not necessarily the 10 that killed the most people in their own numerical sense, though some of them did kill in enormous numbers. 10 weapons that were lethal in the specific sense that matters for understanding the Second World War. Weapons that were decisive in their effect, revolutionary in their technology, or both. Weapons whose existence determined outcomes rather than merely contributing to them. The first is the weapon that made the Second World War possible and did it undid it. The weapon that began as an engineering concept in the 1930s and ended in a flash of light over Japan that killed 70,000 people in a second and changed everything that came after. But before we reach the end of the war, we have to begin at the beginning with the weapons that made the German conquests of 1939 to 1941 possible. And that means beginning with the tank. The German Panzer keempat is not the most famous tank of the Second World War. The Tiger gets more attention. The Sherman gets more American reverence. The T-34 gets more Soviet credit. But the Panzer keempat was the backbone of German armored power from the beginning of the war to its end. The most produced German tank of the entire conflict, and the weapon around which the tactical doctrine of Blitzkrieg was built and executed. Over 8,000 were produced between 1936 and 1945 in a series of progressively upgraded variants that extended the tank's effectiveness far beyond what its original designers had intended. The Panzer keempat entered service as a support tank, intended to provide firepower against enemy fortifications and the infantry positions while the lighter Panzer IS handled anti-tank work. Its original short-barreled 75mm gun was optimized for this role, capable of devastating infantry and the fortified positions but limited in its ability to penetrate the armor of contemporary tanks at long range. This limitation became critical when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and encountered Soviet T-34 and KV-1 tanks whose armor and the armament significantly exceeded German intelligence assessments. The German response was the Panzer keempat Osf F2 and the subsequent variants, which replaced the short-barreled 75mm with a long-barreled version of the same caliber that dramatically improved anti-tank capability. The long 75mm gun could penetrate the T-34's armor at combat ranges, and the upgraded Panzer keempat became the primary German tank killer of the Eastern Front's middle years. The weapon that stabilized German armored operations at a moment when the tactical situation was deteriorating faster than German production could address. The Panzer's significance is not in individual dramatic actions but in sustained operational effectiveness across 6 years of the most intensive armored warfare in history. It was present at Dunkirk, at Moscow, at El Alamein, at Kursk, at Normandy, and in the final battles of ke-1945. Its versatility, its mechanical reliability relative to the more complex Tiger and Panzer designs, and its ability to be progressively upgraded made it a weapon that sustained German armament capability long after the strategic situation had made German victory impossible. But if the Panzer keempat represents the sustained lethality of a weapon system over time, the Tiger represents something different and in many ways more disturbing, the specific psychological impact of a weapon whose reputation for invulnerability exceeded even its considerable actual capability. The Tiger I, the Panzerkampfwagen VI, entered service in 1942 as the German military's response to the specific shock of encountering Soviet and the British tanks that the standard anti-tank weapons could not reliably penetrate. Its 88mm gun, derived from the anti-aircraft cannon that had been pressed into anti-tank service with devastating effectiveness in the Western Desert, could destroy any Allied or Soviet tank at ranges that far exceeded those at which those tanks could damage the Tiger. Its frontal armor, 100mm at its thickest, was initially proof against most Allied anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges. The Tiger was not produced in large numbers, approximately 1,300 in total compared to over 40,000 T-34S, and its mechanical complexity, its weight, and its fuel consumption made it operationally demanding in a way that complicated the logistics of units equipped with it. But its psychological impact far exceeded its numerical contribution to the German order of battle. Allied tank crews developed a condition that military historians have called Tiger phobia, the specific tendency to identify any German tank as a Tiger and to respond to it with a disproportionate level of caution, a psychological phenomenon documented in Allied after-action reports and in the accounts of veterans across multiple theaters. The most famous single Tiger action of the entire war was conducted by SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann at Villers-Bocage in Normandy on June 13, 1944, when Wittmann and his Tiger crew engaged a column of the British 7th Armored Division's vehicles on a road, destroying approximately 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and a number of other vehicles in a single action that temporarily halted the British advance and demonstrated, in the specific context of the Normandy campaign, that the quality of individual weapon systems could still significantly alter tactical outcomes even when strategic momentum had definitively shifted against Germany. The German 88mm gun that gave the Tiger its anti-tank capability deserves its own consideration as a weapon system. Originally designed as a heavy anti-aircraft gun, the Flak 18 and its successors were pressed into ground combat roles in Spain during the Civil War, where German forces discovered that the gun's velocity and the accuracy made it devastatingly effective against tanks at ranges that contemporary anti-tank weapons could not match. In the Western Desert Campaign, the 88 became the primary German anti-tank weapon, its crews learning to use it in hull-down positions and at distances where British tank crews had difficulty identifying the threat before it had already struck. The 88's effectiveness against aircraft was equally significant. It was the primary German heavy anti-aircraft weapon throughout the war, and its deployment in large numbers around German cities, industrial facilities, and military positions created the specific air defense challenge that Allied strategic bombing had to navigate. The gun's rate of fire and its ceiling gave it a combination of capabilities that no more other weapon of the period matched. And its contribution to German defensive effectiveness in multiple domains makes it arguably the single most versatile and consequential individual artillery system of the entire war. The B-17 Flying Fortress represents the Allied counterpart in the air, not in its defensive capability but in the specific strategic vision it embodied and the specific cost at which it pursued that vision. The B-17 was the physical expression of the American theory of strategic bombing, the doctrine that held that precision bombing of enemy industrial infrastructure could destroy the productive capacity that sustained modern warfare and thereby win wars without the catastrophic infantry casualties of the previous World War. The theory was attractive, humane by the standards of the alternatives, and deeply, expansively wrong in the form that the early years of the bombing campaign took. The 8th Air Forces campaign over Germany in 1943 produced casualty rates among bomber crews that exceeded the casualty rates of any comparable military activity in any theater of the war. The Schweinfurt raids of October 1943, in which 60 B-17s were shot down in a single mission against German ball-bearing factories, represented losses that were mathematically unsustainable and strategically inconclusive. The strategic bombing campaign did not produce decisive results until the introduction of long-range escort fighters in 1944 allowed the bombers to operate without the catastrophic losses of the unescorted period. But the B-17 itself, as a weapon system, represented an achievement of engineering that shaped the development of aircraft design for decades. Its ability to absorb damage and to continue flying was legendary among its crews and documented in hundreds of specific cases where aircraft returned to base with catastrophic structural damage that should by any engineering assessment have resulted in the aircraft's loss. The stories of B-17s that flew with half their tail structure shot away, with engines destroyed, with structural failures that opened the fuselage to the sky, are not mythology. They are documented in the maintenance records and the crew accounts that confirm them. The T-34 is the tank that more than any other single weapon system changed the outcome of the Second World War. The Soviet medium tank introduced in 1940 combined sloped armor, which deflected incoming rounds more effectively than the same thickness of vertical armor, with a powerful diesel engine that reduced fire risk compared to the gasoline-powered German tanks, and with a gun capable of engaging the German armor of the period effectively. When German forces encountered it in large numbers in 1941, its combination of capabilities shocked a military that had been assured by its intelligence services that Soviet tank design was primitive. The T-34's most significant characteristic was not its individual performance but its producibility. The Soviets manufactured over 84,000 T-34s during the war, a production figure that dwarfs every other tank program in the conflict. The specific production methodology that made this possible, simplified construction techniques, interchangeable components, factory relocations beyond the Urals that kept production running even as German forces occupied the most developed portions of Soviet industry, represented an industrial achievement as significant as the tank's engineering qualities. At Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, the T-34 in its various versions formed the backbone of the Soviet armored force that absorbed the German offensive and then counterattack with a strength that the Wehrmacht could not match. After Kursk, the T-34 and the production capacity that made it available in overwhelming numbers drove the Soviet advance. That took 2 years and the enormous casualties but ultimately rolled from the Vistula to the Elbe. The Soviet Katyusha multiple rocket launcher represents a different category of weapon, one whose significance lies not in individual accuracy or in the specific penetration of individual targets, but in the specific psychological and the physical effect of massive firepower delivered rapidly across a wide area. The Katyusha, which German soldiers nicknamed Stalin's organ for the specific sound of its rockets in flight, could deliver a salvo of rockets covering a large area in seconds, creating a zone of devastation whose psychological impact on troops under its fire was described in German accounts with a consistency that reveals how distinctive the experience was from conventional artillery. The Katyusha's accuracy was limited by the standards of the period. It was not a precision weapon. It was a mass-effect weapon, designed to saturate an area rather than strike specific targets, and its use was most effective in the Soviet operational style as concentrated fires preceding major offensive operations, where thousands of rockets were launched simultaneously as part of the massive artillery preparations that preceded Soviet offensive operations from 1943 onward. The specific combination of sound, visual spectacle, and the physical destruction that a major Katyusha has produced was unlike anything else on the battlefield of the Second World War. The V-2 ballistic missile is the weapon that most directly shaped the world after the Second World War, not through its effect on the conflict itself, where its contributions were strategically marginal, but through its technical legacy and the specific transfer of its development team to the United States through Operation Paperclip, where Wernher von Braun and his colleagues went on to design the Saturn V rocket that put humans on the moon. The V-2 was the world's first operational ballistic missile, a weapon that traveled at speeds exceeding 4,000 kilometers per hour and descended on its targets from the edge of space with no more warning and no more defense available with 1944 technology. Over 3,000 were launched against London and Antwerp and the other Allied cities, killing approximately 9,000 people. The number is significant but not strategically decisive. What was strategically significant was the demonstration that guided ballistic missiles were technically feasible. A demonstration that both superpowers drew specific lessons from in the decade after the war ended. The specific human cost of the V-2's production exceeded the human cost of its deployment. The Metalwork factory in the Harz Mountains, where V-2s were assembled using concentration camp labor from the Dora camp, killed more people through overwork, malnutrition, and the deliberate violence than the V-2 rockets killed when deployed. More people died building the V-2 than were killed by it, a specific moral accounting that the post-war careers of its designers in American space programs did not fully address. The Japanese Zero Fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M, was the weapon that made the Japanese Pacific strategy possible in 1941 and the early 1942. The long-range carrier-based fighter that enabled Pearl Harbor and the subsequent expansion of Japanese power across the Pacific. At the time of its introduction, the Zero was the most capable carrier-based fighter in the world, combining extraordinary range, a tight turning radius, and the adequate firepower in a design that achieved its performance through a specific engineering choice that made it lethal in 1941 and vulnerable by 1943. The Zero achieved its range and maneuverability by sacrificing pilot protection and structural strength. It had no more self-sealing fuel tanks and no more armor protection for its pilot. The weight saved by these omissions applied instead the additional fuel capacity and the structural lightness that allowed the turning performance that made it dangerous in a dogfight. When the Americans learned to avoid engaging it in turning combat, they used hit-and-run tactics that exploited the Zero's structural weakness at high speeds and its vulnerability when struck. The Zero's tactical advantage disappeared. American pilots who attempted to turn fight with Zeros died. American pilots who used diving attacks, fired, and immediately dove away to disengage found that the Zero could not follow them in a high-speed dive without losing structural integrity. The napalm incendiary bomb is the weapon on this list whose moral accounting is most disturbing, and the most consistently avoided in the standard histories of the Second World War. Developed by Harvard chemists working for the American military in 1942. Napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture whose specific viscosity allowed it to adhere to surfaces while burning, was first used operationally in 1943 and became the primary incendiary weapon used by the American military in the air campaign against Japanese cities from March 1945 onward. General Curtis LeMay's decision to switch from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks on Japanese cities in March 1945 produced results in terms of physical destruction that exceeded anything that had been achieved by the previous years of strategic bombing. The raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9 10 1945, using over 300 B-29S carrying napalm bombs at low altitude, created a firestorm that killed between 80,000 and 100,000 people, destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city, and left over 1 million people homeless. It was, in terms of lives taken in a single night of conventional bombing, the most destructive air raid in history, exceeding Dresden, and Hamburg and every other bombing of the war except the atomic bomb attacks that followed. LeMay subsequently estimated that if America had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He made this assessment not as a moral judgment on his own actions but as a practical observation about the specific standard that would have been applied to the deliberate targeting of civilian populations. He continued to believe that the incendiary campaign against Japanese cities shortened the war and reduced the total casualties that an invasion of Japan would have produced. Whether that calculation was correct is one of the genuinely contested moral questions of the Second World War, one that the historical evidence has not resolved and may not be capable of resolving. The final weapon on this list is the one that ended the war and that ended the specific chapter of human history that the Second World War represented, the atomic bomb. 2 bombs. Little Boy over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, killing approximately 70,000 people immediately and a comparable number in the following months from radiation effects. Fat Man over Nagasaki on August 19, killing approximately 40,000 immediately and more subsequently. The Japanese surrender on August 15, announced by Emperor Hirohito in a radio broadcast that meant Japanese heard for the first time not as the emperor's voice but as a voice at all, the specific cultural distance between the emperor and his people having been such that the broadcast was the first time none of his subjects heard him speak. The atomic bomb's specific technical achievement, the sustained nuclear fission chain reaction first achieved at the University of Chicago in December 1942, the implosion design that made Fat Man possible. The specific industrial scale of the Manhattan Project that turned physics into engineering in 30 months at a cost of $2 billion, was the most concentrated application of scientific and industrial resources to a specific weapons problem in history. The physicists who built it understood what they were building. None of them had misgivings before it was used and more severe misgivings after. Robert Oppenheimer quoted the Bhagavad Gita at Trinity. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He was not the only one in the deserted morning who understood what the test meant for the world that came after it. The 10 weapons in this documentary killed in total somewhere between 30 and 40 million people. Our estimated encompasses the direct casualties of the weapons themselves, the strategic consequences of their use, and the specific human cost of their production. They were built by engineers who were doing their jobs, deployed by soldiers who were following orders, and directed by commanders who were trying to win a war. The moral accounting of weapons does not lie primarily with the people who built and used them in the specific circumstances of the most destructive war in human history. It lies with the understanding that we take from their existence about what human beings are capable of designing, producing, and deploying when the institutional framework of war removes the constraints that peacetime civilization maintains around the application of organized violence to human beings. Those constraints are not natural. They are constructed. They can be removed. And the Second World War is the specific demonstration, conducted at a scale of approximately 60 million dead, of what happens when they are. The weapons are in museums now. The knowledge of how to build them is not in museums. It is in textbooks and the laboratories and the institutional memory of the organizations that their development created. The tank and the long-range bomber and the ballistic missile and the atomic bomb did not disappear with the war that produced them. They evolved. Their descendants are operational today in the arsenals of the states that have inherited the specific legacy of the Second World War's weapons revolution. We live inside that legacy. We live with the weapons that the Second World War built in the specific sense that we have not found a way to invent them, to remove the specific knowledge that produced them from the world, or to ensure that the institutional and the political constraints that govern their use are sufficient to prevent their use. That question, whether the constraints are sufficient, is the question that the 10 weapons in this documentary were built as the first answer to, and the answer that 60 million dead people gave to it is one that every subsequent generation has been living with since August 1945.